Welcome to Casual Friday. So it's actually Tuesday. I'm recording this the same day I'm recording my Technique Tuesday video because when this video goes live, I will be at Yarn Over here in Minneapolis. So I needed to record this a couple days early. So a couple things I'm going to talk about today. One, I'm going to talk about my last Latvian Mitten class, what I learned and what I didn't learn in that last class that I had hoped to find out. Then I want to talk about a blanket that I'm working on. I started working on it last fall and it's was put to the side for a while. And I need to pull it out, and I'll explain why it's kind of urgent that I complete this project. It's sequence knitting, so I'll talk a little bit about what sequence knitting is and my process for designing this particular blanket. And then I'll tell you the story about why I even came to knit this blanket. Okay, so I went to my last Latvian Mitten class on Saturday, and I had a couple of goals. One was I wanted to watch the teacher knit, and I mentioned that to her at the beginning. She said, "Oh, I didn't bring any knitting with me." I said, "Oh, I can let you knit on mine," but I needed to get a little bit further in it, and then we were talking, and it never happened. Then the second thing I wanted to do was to look at the mittens that she had brought to the class to show as examples and turn them inside out and look at those. That was the second thing I wanted to do. And I also wanted to look at this home ec book that she had shown us. It's for 6th grade girls, and it's was published in the 1990s, and she had shown us how there was a section in there that was teaching how to knit mittens. It was teaching how to knit a basic mitten, each of the mitten parts, and I wondered if it had anything in there about knitting the traditional Latvian mittens within that home ec book. So those were my goals for the class. So the first disappointment was that she had forgotten to bring the mittens with her. And I was like, oh, and so I was talking to the class about what I'd been discovering in the past couple of weeks about parallel floats versus rotating floats versus, and how not every culture is wanting or expecting to have yarn dominance or, and that sort of thing. So we're talking about it, and I brought the swatches that I had shown you in the past couple of weeks that demonstrated yarn dominance and how you could get it regardless of which hand or how many hands you knit with, and we were talking about all of that, and we were talking about how each of us knits and what we do and the struggles and all of that. So later, so she had forgotten to bring the mittens with her, and that was kind of a disappointment. But it turned out later that one of the women taking the class actually works there at Ingebrigtsen's, where where our classroom is, and that's where the mittens were all hanging for the exhibition a few weeks before. So she had been there when the exhibition was first being set up. And the first thing that she had done was to turn the mittens inside out to see what they looked like on the inside. And she said every one of them was lined. And which is something that they talk about in these books on Latvian mittens, is that often they're lined. It adds another layer of warmth to the mittens, and it hides all of those floats and everything. And they give you different strategies for how to do it. And so every one of those mittens in the exhibition had been lined. And then also the teacher knew that those mittens that she had brought to the class, which had actually been knit by, I think, someone that goes to her church, she knew that they had all been lined as well. So we wouldn't have been able to see anything on the inside anyway. But she did bring the Latvian home ec book with her. So I asked to look through it. And I found the section that showed how to just knit a plain mitten. And then I flipped through and I found a section on the Latvian mittens. Of course, this book is written in Latvian, so I didn't know what it said. But I found a section. It was clearly, it had two pictures. It had a picture of the front of something done in color work that was kind of puckered, so it had poor tension. And then it had a picture of the backside of a piece of stranded color work. And I asked the teacher, you know, what does it say in there? And you can see in the photograph that the floats are rotated. So, so clearly that rotated floats and parallel floats are something that are both used in Latvian mittens. And it's probably, whether somebody ever uses parallel floats is probably just varies by individual, but certainly everybody does rotate floats at least some of the time, depending on how long the spans are between color changes and how many colors they're using at one time. So at the very end of the class, we laid all the mittens out and we took some pictures, and I took a little bit of video of the mittens just so you can see what we did in our class. So I'm trying to see where my book is on sequence knitting. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about sequence knitting and a project I'm working on that uses it. I'm trying to see when this book came out. This book came out, I thought it was 3 years. This book came out in 2015. It's called Sequence Knitting, and it's by Cecilia, I'm going to say Campochiaro. And I think her mother was a librarian, and so when she had this book done, she wanted to make sure it had a library binding. It was really important to her that this be a kind of book that could be used as a reference book, so that it can just lay flat on the table and you can use it without having to weight it down or anything. So sequence knitting, the idea behind sequence knitting is that you can have something that's very easily memorized, like your stitch pattern is very easily memorized, so you don't have to carry your pattern around with you. So it's easy, but it's engaging. So it's not tedious, it's not boring, it holds your interest, which is something that a lot of knitters are looking for. Now the concept is fairly simple, but it can be used in, I think it's four different ways, and I probably won't be able to remember all 4 off the top of my head. But the idea is that you have a sequence of stitches. So let's say it's knit 2, purl 2. But the number of stitches that you're using, so knit 2, purl 2 is a multiple of 4, but the number of stitches that you're using is not a multiple of 4. It might be a multiple of 4 plus 1 or multiple of 4 minus 1. So it doesn't have to be just one off. You know, if you have a really long sequence, it could be, you know, any number. If you could have a 9-stitch sequence that could be repeated and just be off by 3 stitches or 6 stitches for the last repeat. So you memorize your sequence and you can just knit it. Well, if you're knitting flat, you're going to be knitting back and forth. So one option is that you start every row, you work every row exactly the same. And that's how, what's it called, mistake rib is worked. You have a knit 2, purl 2 sequence, but you're using a multiple of 4 stitches plus 3 or 4 stitches plus 1. Or you could say 4 minus 1 or 4 plus 1 or 4 minus 1, either way. So you work every row as starting with knit 2, purl 2, and then you're going to end up not being able to complete the entire sequence at the end of the row. And then when you start the next row, you start at the beginning of the sequence again. So that's one way of working a sequence. Another way to work a sequence would be wherever you left off in your sequence, that's where you start up on the next row. And for these kinds of sequences, you're working back and forth. So the last stitch you worked in one row is the first stitch you work in another. So you're going to get a very different result than if you were working that same number of stitches in the round. So in the round, you're working in a spiral. So there are ways of creating spiral effects because of that. So you can work the same sequence every row, or you can pick up where you left off, or you can do it in the round. And I think there's one other way. I'm not going to look it up, but this book is worth it. It's got a huge stitch dictionary in there. So, I mean, the concept is simple, but figuring out what something is actually going to look like is not always obvious. You can chart it out, but the way knits and purls interact with each other isn't always exactly how you chart it out isn't always exactly what something looks like, just because of the way knits and purls interact with each other horizontally and vertically. So if you wanted to just knit nothing but rectangular things, or even shawls that are things that are, she has ways of increasing things and maintaining sequences at the same time. You could have, you know, a lifetime of different sequences to work that you could see what they're going to look like. One of the really interesting things about these sequences is some sort of unexpected effects. So you can work garter stitch, for example, by knitting every row, or you could purl every row. But if you alternate columns of knit garter stitch with purl garter stitch, those columns, they get this like vertical separation between each of those columns, and the garter stitch is offset by one row. And it's a subtle but really interesting effect. And then if you add to that you alternate between two colors. So you work 2 rows in one color and then work 2 rows in an alternate color, you get a really interesting striped effect. And that is what I'm going to show you here. So I showed this blanket in a video I did, I think it was in December or January, on avoiding color blips. And then, so it's how to avoid them, but also how you can use them. I gave some information on that. So here you can see these are columns of knit garter alternating with purl garter. So on this side, if we get to the edge, then you can see better. So this edge right here, the stripes just look normal, like you have a dark green, a light green, a dark green, a light green. But then the second stripe, you see all those color blips. Well, if you turn it around on the other side, then it's the one on the edge that has the color blips, and the column next to that is plain. So that's so it's reversible, but it's sort of a mirror of each other. So I have this little blanket that I'm knitting. It's got the edges on this section are knit 3, purl 3 garter. I have that on the right and also on the left. And then in the middle, I don't know how many stitches that is. Let's see, 1, 2. So the middle section is 15 stitches of knit purl, of knit garter, purl garter. And this blanket is made up of 3 sections. So the middle section will be slightly different than the first section and the last section. I think sequence knitting is really interesting. And again, even though the concept is simple, it can be used in really unexpected ways. And I totally think that this book is worth it. It's an expensive book, but again, it's got this library binding. It's meant to be a reference book. And I think it's really worth it. Now I want to tell you, why I'm making this blanket and who it's for. And it really needs to be done very soon. I'm going to have to get busy on it. It has to do with our dog. Every once in a while, when I'm doing these Casual Fridays, you'll hear a dog barking, and I'll say, "Oh, Herbie," and then I'll have to wait until he's done. And so he shows up every so often. So let me go get him. I'll be right back. Okay. This is Herbie. Herbie is not happy to be held. That is not. Okay. Say hi, Herbie. Hi. Yes. We got Herbie 3 years ago when he was 4 years old. We got him from a Shih Tzu rescue organization here in the Twin Cities. We had a Shih Tzu before. Our previous Shih Tzu had died the year before when he was about 14. We'd had him for 10 years. We'd gotten him at the Humane Society. Almost every dog at the Humane Society at that time was either a German Shepherd mix or a Black Lab mix. And there was this little white dog that had been shaved and was, standing on his hind legs doing this, not making a sound. And he just seemed like a really great dog for us, and so we took him home, and we really loved him. He was very needy and clingy, and but we loved him, and he wasn't very bright, and he didn't shed. That was something that we really liked because my older daughter, it turned out, is allergic to dogs, and our dog Cotton didn't shed, so we really liked that aspect of the Shih Tzu. So Cotton died the spring my youngest daughter was graduating from high school. And I have always had pets, and I knew I'd want another pet, but I wanted to wait until I missed having a pet rather than missed Cotton. Because I knew it wouldn't be replacing him. But I knew that I would want a pet at some point. And my husband was kind of like, let's wait. You know, we're gonna have an empty nest. Let's see what that's like. So let's not rush into getting another dog. And so our youngest daughter went off to college, and about a month later, I'm like, okay, I'm ready. And he's like, no, not yet, not yet. And you know, by the middle of the winter, I really, really wanted a pet. And I was talking to the squirrels that were hanging out on the trees outside the kitchen window. I'd see a bird land somewhere, and I'd be talking to the bird. I really wanted a pet. So the girls were going to be coming home for spring break at different times in March. And I thought, I'd really like to have a new dog for when they come home for spring break. So I really liked the Shih Tzu. So I looked on the Shih Tzu Rescue website, and I saw that there were 2 dogs about 3 to 4 years old. And so I made an inquiry about them, and they responded right away with information about one of the dogs. Didn't mention the other one. And when can we bring him over? So to meet you and, fill out the form. And, we've lived in our house forever. We have an established groomer, established vet, we know what Shih Tzus are like. We have a fenced yard. We had everything. We didn't have little kids in the house, and we're home all the time. We met all their criteria. So that wasn't an issue. So she brought this dog over to visit us. And, he was very, very interested in, sniffing all over, and took him for a little walk, and he was really pulling on the leash. And I'm like, well, we're going to have to train him out of that. And we were kind of familiar with how we, present ourselves as the authority, the pack leader over a dog, and the kinds of things that we need to do. We were familiar with that with our other dog. So we're like, okay, we're willing to do this. And again, our previous dog was very clingy. Like if I went down to the laundry room, he would be barking and barking. Where are you? Where are you? And so we adopted this dog, and they said he had been given up because his first owners had a 14-month-old toddler, and Herbie was nipping the toddler unprovoked. And I thought, I've had a couple of 14-month-old children before, and they are very erratic. And so, you wonder, but they had brought a trainer in. The trainer wasn't able to help them. And so they gave Herbie up. Then he was in at least one foster home at that time. All I knew was that he was in this foster home where we were adopting from. And he had been fine there for about a month. And then he started going after her dogs, who were Shih Tzus, and apparently even going after her a little bit. And they were concerned about him, that he was aggressive and that he might need to be euthanized. So they brought in this other trainer who's really more of a behaviorist. And he walked in, and he just observed what was going on, and watched what Herbie was doing versus what the foster mother's dogs were doing. And he said, no, you don't have any rules or boundaries or limitations in your house. And he's establishing them because you're not doing it. And so he's going to leave the room now. So that's the problem. So you need to change your behavior. You need to be the one establishing it. Well, as the case is a lot of times for people who just love animals, especially when they love little animals, um, they don't treat them like dogs a lot of times. They treat them like stuffed animals. And I mean, they don't treat them like their kids, because you wouldn't treat your kid that way either. So she just didn't have it in her to do, to change. So when we said we would adopt him, she's like, here you go. And it took a while. He seemed a little standoffish at first. And I thought, I kept thinking, did we make a mistake? He doesn't really seem like he likes us. And I couldn't do with him what I could do with my other dog. Like if he was sitting in the middle of where I wanted to sleep on my bed, my previous dog, I could just put my hands underneath him and move him. And I put my hands underneath Herbie, and he nipped at me. And I was like, ooh, okay. So we're like, okay, so we have to take ownership of the space. So I just move in on him and tell him to move, and then he would move. But it took, I would say, a couple of months before he trusted us that we were actually in charge. We had to prove to him that we were in charge. And we had been warned not to let him around little kids, not to have him in playgroups, not to take him to the dog park, all of these things. So I would walk him for like 3 miles a day, and it would never be enough for him. He could always go more. And occasionally we would meet another dog, and he would be so happy to meet that other dog, be so friendly and wiggly and happy, and he would always want to say hello to the people. And if we ever went on a walk and he didn't get to meet another dog or another person, he didn't want to come home. He would be kind of sad about it. And taking him on these long walks was a constant, I had to constantly assert my role as I'm the one in charge. I get to say where we're going and how and which direction we're going, and what trees how many times you get to pee on every single tree. At some point we're just walking and I'm in charge. And it wasn't pleasant. So after about 3 months, we'd had him for about 3 months, and I really had fallen in love with him by then, but there were certain things that were hard. They had this Shih Tzu rescue picnic that June, and so I thought, well, I wonder what it's going to be like around all of these other dogs and all these people, because we'd been warned, don't let him around there because he's going to be kind of overwhelmed. And so we take him there. He was in heaven. He was saying hi to every dog. Some other dogs were like, yip, yip, yip. He was saying hi to everybody. He was so happy. It was so exciting. And they had a little enclosed area. It looks like it's probably a hockey rink in the wintertime, but maybe it's a little dog park, enclosed dog park in the summertime. And so there were some people in there with their Shih Tzus, like maybe 5 or 6 people with that. Well, let's try it in there. He seems like he's okay. And he went in there, and it was the first time we actually got to see him run. Like he just ran across. He was so happy. He went up to every single person, said hi, went up to every dog, sniffed every dog. The other dogs were all just standing around. None of them came over, were the least bit interested in us. But Herbie was just so, I'm like, oh, I felt terrible. Like he was so happy in this situation. I thought, and he seems really okay with other dogs, and he seems great with kids. He really liked kids too. So I thought, well, at the end of the summer, we'd had him for 6 months. And I'm like, I'm just going to get the dog license. I'm going to get the permit for the dog park. I'm going to take him. So the first day we walked into this dog park, Herbie marched in. He had to, mark right at the entrance. And then he trotted, he never does anything super fast. Like if you call him, he walks over. When we come home from the store, it's sort of, he's like, what's up? And he might come and say hi, and he's wagging his tail, but he doesn't get like super excited. That's just not his style. So he walked in the dog park and he saw these humans all congregated in the middle. So he trotted over there, and there's this woman said, well, there's a dog with a lot of confidence. And this man said, what's your dog's name? And I said, Herbie. He said, where'd you get him? So I saw a Shih Tzu rescue, and then he's like, this one or that one? And I'm like, well, the second one. And he's like, was that always his name when he was in? And I said, yeah, yes. He said, oh, I worked with him when he was in the rescue. And I'm like, oh, you're the trainer who worked him. So his name is Max. He is the trainer who said to them, this is not an aggressive dog. Do not euthanize him for that. So that was Max. And then over time, Max would be there at the dog park, and he could explain to us what the dogs were doing and why they were doing that. And sometimes, and Herbie had developed this routine where he would come into the dog park, and he would go around the entire perimeter of the dog park. It's several acres. It's pretty big. And he'd go to a lot of the trees. He'd do this whole routine all the way around. Then he'd come in the middle, he'd say hello to the people, and then he'd kind of just keep an eye on what was going on. And if puppies came and were really exuberant, he would correct them. But he'd correct, and he would immediately be calm again. He's so calm. If Max or another trainer brought a new dog in that they were trying to rehabilitate in foster care before it could be adopted out, and they'd bring him in with a leash, and the dog was, first time was really afraid, Herbie would go over with this completely relaxed attitude, very gentle. Hey, it's really nice here. You're going to like it. He's just a very calming influence. And sometimes there would be situations like somebody brought a 3-year-old pit bull mix that just didn't listen, and she was training him, and it was a dog that didn't listen, and he didn't listen to her. He didn't listen to, he wasn't listening to anything. He was just doing his own thing. He probably didn't trust people. There was a German Shepherd that was not neutered that was there, that was probably just over a year old, and the two of them got into this eye lock, and Max was there. And so people were like, Max, what do we do? So the German Shepherd was one that was there all the time. So Max got behind the German Shepherd and tried to give the same energy to the pit bull that the German Shepherd was giving him, to see if he could, break this eye lock up. He wasn't having any luck. Now, the corner of his eye, Max sees little Herbie come around to the side, and he's like perpendicular to them. And so Max thought, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to try that. So he came around perpendicular. So he and Herbie were both kind of this way. And then the two dogs started doing this to see what Max and Herbie were doing, and they were able to break them up. And the woman who brought the pit bull then, drags her dog to the gate. Herbie follows them. Max didn't know what this pit bull, was going to do. And he bit Herbie. He did that thing where you just kind of like this. And he said he did it pretty hard on him. And Herbie just completely ignored him. He's like, Herbie never backs down. He's never intimidated. He always follows through. So he escorted the woman and her dog to the gate, and he stood there until they were about 15 feet away, and then he turned around and came back in. Never once barked, never growled, never did anything. It was just all attitude. And so Max said that's when he knew he could always trust Herbie, and he, watches to see what Herbie does. And he borrows Herbie sometimes for his puppy classes, or if he has a client who has like a really big puppy that's like 12 months old they're having trouble with, and Max can't quite get through to them that it isn't physically dominating the dog, it's all about your attitude. He'll borrow Herbie. He's only little, and he'll have the dog sitting, and then if the puppy tries to get up and go somewhere, Herbie just stands up and takes a step forward calmly, and then their dog sits down. And that's when the people realize, oh, it doesn't take physically dominating our dog to get him to listen to us. So Herbie, he's just an amazing dog. Obviously, my dog is great. But when we got him, I thought he was just a spoiled dog that, whatever. And he had a huge basket of toys from his previous home. And people would say, oh, thank you for rescuing him. I'm like, oh, he's just, he's just spoiled. He's fine. But the more I found out about him and his past life, the more I realized he really almost wasn't here. And if it weren't for Max, Herbie wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have him. And he's such a great dog. We really are happy to have him in our household. So a year ago, Max got married. And in May, he and his wife are expecting their first baby. So that is who I am knitting the blanket for. Usually when I knit a baby gift for someone, I just do like a baby hat, something quick and easy and really cute. But I really felt like Max deserves something a little bit bigger that will last a long time and be a little bit more meaningful. So that is the story of Herbie, how I got him, and why I'm knitting this blanket for Max and his wife and baby. So that's it for Casual Friday. I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.